Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a topic that feels, well, it feels both ancient and incredibly urgent at the same time.
It really does.
It's a subject that I think helps explain everything from, say, why your open plan office is so distracting to why massive, well-intentioned government projects can end in absolute disaster.
And even why entire ecosystems collapse. It's that broad.
It is. We are doing a deep dive into the landmark work by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State.
This is one of those books, once you read it, you can never really unsee the world in the same way. It's like it changes your retinal settings.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
You start looking at a city grid or, a plantation of pine trees or even something as simple as a standardized test, and you suddenly see this hidden machinery underneath it all.
The architecture of control, in a way.
Exactly. And I have to admit, when I first picked this up years ago, the title Seeing Like a State made me think, okay, this is going to be a very dry treatise on bureaucracy.
A manual for tax collectors, maybe.
All right. A bit of a slog, but it's not that at all. It's actually, when you get into it, it's a tragedy. It's a story about how we perceive reality, and more importantly, how that perception can go catastrophically wrong.
It is a tragedy. It's about this fundamental conflict between the messy, complex, sort of organic, tangled nature of reality and the rigid, simplified, abstract grids we try to impose on top of it.
And the central puzzle Scott is wrestling with, the question that drives the whole book, is this. Why do these huge, large-scale, top-down attempts to improve the human condition?
Schemes backed by enormous resources, by scientific authority, often by genuinely good intentions.
By genuine benevolence. Why do they so frequently, so predictably result in disaster?
And we are not talking about small administrative hiccups here, are we?
Not at all. We are talking about some of the great disasters of the 20th century. We're talking famines, forced relocations of millions of people, total ecological collapse.
And the really chilling part, the thing that I think makes this book so essential, is that Scott argues these disasters didn't happen just because the people in charge were stupid.
Or even that they were necessarily evil. That's the easy answer, isn't it?
It's the easy answer. We love to blame incompetence or malice. It's comforting to say, oh, that dictator was just a monster, or that planner was an idiot. But Scott says, no, that's not the whole story. The failure is. It's baked into the very mechanism of how a large system tries to understand a complex world.
It is a crisis of perception.
Precisely.
And this is so relevant to us now. We live in a world that is completely obsessed with data. We're governed by algorithms, by metrics, by key performance indicators, by centralized planning.
Every click we make, every form we fill out, we're being turned into data points.
So even though this book talks about, Prussian forests from the 1700s and Soviet farms, it feels like it's talking directly about our lives right now.
It absolutely is. And
Yeah.
the core concept we really need to get our heads around today is this idea of legibility.
Legibility, as in being readable.
Exactly. The state, or really any large organization, a corporation, a school system, it cannot handle the full, blooming, buzzing confusion of reality. It's too much information. It's too chaotic.
So it has to simplify things.
It has to. In order to govern, to manage, to tax, to conscript an army, the state must simplify reality into a version it can understand. It has to make the world legible.
Like summary.
A very specific kind of summary. And the central argument of this book is that this process of simplification, while it seems necessary, is also incredibly dangerous. Because it doesn't just describe the world, it actively changes it. And in doing so, it often destroys the underlying complexity that made the world function in the first place.
Okay, so before we dive into the deep history here, I think we should probably set some ground rules for this discussion.
Good idea.
This deep dive is focused on the mechanisms of power, of legibility, of simplification. It's a systems analysis.
Right. We are not here to critique a specific political ideology or get into a policy debate. We're not saying government is bad or planning is bad.
No. We are looking at the machinery of how states function and how that machinery shapes their perception, regardless of whether they call themselves capitalist, socialist, monarchist, whatever. It's about the tool, not just the person using it.
The logic of the system itself.
Exactly. So with that framework in mind, let's unpack this. And to understand how a state sees, Scott takes us back to a place I really did not expect. He takes us to the German forests of the late 18th century.
the parable of the scientific forest. This is, I think, the foundational metaphor for the entire book. It's brilliant. If you can really understand what happened to the forest, you can understand the logic behind the Soviet Union, and you can understand the logic behind modern urban planning.
So paint the picture for us. What did a forest actually look like in, say, Prussia or Saxony before the state really got its hands on it?
It was what you'd call a naturalist's forest. And that means it was a chaotic, vibrant, unbelievable mess.
In a good way.
In the best way. You would have had dozens of different species of trees, oaks, beeches, hornbeams, pines, birches. They were all different ages. You'd have huge ancient trees next to tiny saplings fighting for a patch of light.
Lots of dead wood on the ground, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Old rotting logs covered in moss and fungi, thick underbrush, tangles of vines. And this is crucial. It wasn't just trees. It was a social space. It was a commons.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the local peasants used that forest for everything. They would graze their pigs on the acorns from the oak trees. They had customary rights to collect fallen branches for firewood. They foraged for berries, mushrooms, medicinal herbs. It was their pantry, their pharmacy, their fuel depot.
So it was a fully integrated ecosystem, both biologically and socially. The human economy and the natural economy were woven together.
Perfectly put. They were one and the same. But here's the problem. If you are the crown, the central state, sitting in a palace in Berlin, and you need revenue to fund your army, this forest is a complete nightmare.
Because it's illegible.
It's utterly illegible. It's opaque. How on earth do you tax a forest where peasants are taking firewood based on ancient, unwritten customary rights? How do you calculate the timber yield when every tree is a different species, a different size, a different age, and they're all mixed together?
You can't just send a guy with a clipboard in there.
He wouldn't know where to start. It's a hiding place for poachers, for deserters. From the state's perspective, it's a fiscal black hole. The state looked at this complex living ecology, and they didn't see a forest. They saw a resource. They had what Scott calls a fiscal lens.
All they wanted to know was how much lumber is in there and how much cash can it generate for the treasury.
That was the only question that mattered. And so to answer that question, they invented scientific forestry.
And this is where it all starts to go wrong.
This is the original sin, in a way, the birth of this mindset. And it started with the invention of something called the normal bomb.
The standard tree.
The standard tree, the average tree. The cameralists, these early state scientists, they created these complex mathematical tables to calculate the volume of wood in a given stand of trees. But the problem was, the math didn't fit the messy reality of the forest.
The trees in the real world didn't match the trees in their equations.
Not at all. So they were faced with a choice. Do you change the math to try and account for the complexity, or
do you change the reality to fit the math?
Exactly. And they chose the latter. This is the key moment.
Yeah.
They didn't just decide to measure reality. They decided to engineer it.
So what did they do?
They clear-cut the chaotic, mixed, multi-generational forest. They just leveled it. They banned the peasants from grazing their pigs or collecting firewood because that just, it messed up the calculations. It was waste.
Is simplified the social dimension first?
They had to. And then they replanted. But they didn't replant the old mix of species. They planted a single, fast-growing, high-yield species.
Norway spruce.
Norway spruce. A pure monoculture.
And they didn't just scatter the seeds?
Oh, no. This was scientific. They planted them in perfectly straight geometric rows, like soldiers on parade. They planted them all at the same time so they would all be the same age and the same size. They meticulously cleared out all the underbrush, the vines, anything that wasn't a regulation spruce tree.
I can just visualize this. It looks less like a forest and more like a cornfield, but with trees.
Well,
a lumber factory without a roof.
That's exactly what it was designed to be, a one-commodity machine. And from the perspective of the state planner, it was beautiful. It was sublime. It was legible.
Now the guy with the clipboard can do his job.
Now he can. A forester could walk down a straight row, count the trees, consult his tables, and know within a tiny margin of error exactly how many cubic meters of lumber were standing there ready for harvest. It was efficient, it was predictable, it was orderly, and for a while, it worked spectacularly.
Right. Scott points out that for the first generation, about 80 years or so, the yields were incredible.
They surged. The state planners must have been patting themselves on the back. They had conquered messy, unpredictable nature with science and geometry. They had stripped away the superstition, the peasant clutter, and replaced it with pure, profitable reason.
But then, the other shoe dropped. The consequence, the Germans even have a specific word for it, don't they? Waldsterben.
Waldsterben. Forest death. By the second and third generation of these spruce plantations, the whole system began to collapse.
The yields plummeted.
Plummeted. The
Yeah.
trees were sickly, stunted. The whole project was failing.
So why? What had the planners, in their elegant simplification, what had they missed?
They missed all the invisible work that the mess was doing. They missed the ecosystem.
For example,
Well, by clearing the underbrush and getting rid of the broadleaf trees, they destroyed the habitat for the birds and insects that kept pests in check.
so pests that might have been a minor nuisance in a diverse forest became a plague.
A plague. By planting only spruce, they depleted the specific nutrients that spruce need from the soil. In a natural forest, the fallen leaves of different trees create a rich, diverse humus that replenishes everything.
A closed loop.
Right. But the scientific forest broke that loop. The endless rows of spruce needles made the soil acidic and barren. It wasn't a life cycle anymore. It was a mining operation. They were mining the soil's fertility.
And because it was a monoculture, it was incredibly fragile.
That's the critical systems insight here. A diverse system is resilient. If a particular beetle attacks the oak trees in a mixed forest, okay, you might lose some oaks. But the beeches survive, the pines survive, the forest as a whole stands.
But in a monoculture,
If a pest that loves spruce gets into your spruce-only forest and every single tree is a spruce and every tree is the same age and thus has the same vulnerabilities, you lose everything. The entire forest dies.
and it wasn't just pests, was it?
No, even the wind became a mortal enemy. In a real forest, the uneven canopy breaks up the wind. In the scientific forest, the wind would hit the edge of the plantation, tunnel down those perfect, straight rows like a wind tunnel in a lab, and just flatten entire sections.
So in their attempt to simplify the forest to make it easy to manage and control, they actually stripped it of its own immune system. They removed all the complex, interlocking feedback loops that allowed it to survive in the first place.
Precisely. They created an engineered reality that looked perfect on a spreadsheet, but was biologically dead on its feet. And Scott's profound argument, and this is why the book is so powerful, is that states do this to everything. They treat human societies exactly like the Prussian foresters treated the woods.
Which is a terrifying thought. And that brings us perfectly to the second major part of this, legibility in statecraft, moving from trees to people. You mentioned earlier that pre-modern states were essentially blind.
Blind in a very specific administrative way. Imagine you're a king in, say, France in the year 1400. You might claim to rule a vast territory, but in reality, you actually don't know who lives in your kingdom.
You don't have a census.
You don't have a census. You don't know how many people there are. You don't know what they do for a living. You don't know how much they produce. You don't even know exactly where the boundaries of the villages are or what people own.
Because everything was local. The knowledge was local.
Everything was intensely, stubbornly local. Scott has these wonderful examples of how measurements used to be human scale, tied to specific tasks and places. You didn't measure land in abstract units like acres or hectares. You measured it in mornings.
A morning of land being.
The amount of land a man with a team of oxen could plow in a single morning.
Which, of course, varies wildly depending on how strong the man is, how good his oxen are, how rocky the soil is, whether the land is on a steep hill.
Exactly. It's a measure rooted in practical reality, not abstract geometry. Or you'd measure grain by the cartload. But a cartload in village A might be twice the size of a cartload in village B, depending on the size of their carts.
And this must have driven the central state absolutely crazy.
It made centralized taxation almost impossible. If the king's decree says, every village must give me 10% of their grain harvest, and the peasant from village B shows up with his tiny cart, the king gets cheated.
It's like trying to run a global logistics company where every single driver gets to decide for themselves what 1 mile or 1 pound means. It's unworkable.
It is. So the modern state had to standardize, had to impose a uniform grid on everything. Scott uses this fantastic analogy of beekeeping.
Right, the beehive.
He says that pre-modern statecrafts was like old-school beekeeping. Get the honey, which is the taxes, the revenue. You basically had to destroy the hive. You'd smoke out the bees or drown them and smash the honeycomb.
It's brutal, inefficient.
And you enrage the surviving bees. It's a one-time destructive extraction. The modern state, however, is like the modern beehive.
Those white boxes you see in fields.
Yes, with removable frames. There's a special screen called a queen excluder to keep the queen and her brood in one section, separate from the pure honey production in another. The whole thing is designed for easy inspection. The beekeeper can slide out a frame, see exactly what's happening inside, and extract the honey without destroying the colony.
It's designed for sustainable monitoring and extraction.
That's the goal. The modern state wanted to turn all of society into that neat, legible white box.
But people are, I'd say, a bit trickier than bees. We generally don't like being put in boxes to be monitored and extracted from.
And that's the point. For most of history, illegibility being messy, hard to count, hard to find, was a survival strategy for ordinary people.
It was a form of resistance.
A powerful form of passive resistance. If the state can't understand your local measurements, they can't tax you effectively. If you don't have a permanent last name, they can't put you on the conscription roll for the army.
The surname thing is just fascinating. I think most of us just assume last names have existed forever.
Not at all. Not in a fixed, heritable way. For most of history, you were just John. Maybe you're John the baker to distinguish you from John the miller, or you were John, son of Peter. But that's fluid. If John the baker's son becomes a weaver, the name changes.
And if there are 5 different Johns in the village, the tax collector is helpless.
Who owes what? Who's who? So the state had to impose permanent, heritable surnames. This was a massive political project. They needed a unique, permanent identifier for every single subject. You are John Smith, you will always be John Smith, and your children will be Smiths.
It's the direct ancestor of the Social Security number or the national insurance number.
It creates a grid of identity. And this is the deep point Scott makes. These state-imposed simplifications don't just record reality, they fundamentally change it. Take land ownership, for instance.
Right. This was another area of local complexity.
Immense complexity. In a traditional village, land rights were a tangled web. Maybe I have the right to grow wheat on this specific plot of land. But after I harvest my wheat, maybe you have the right to graze your sheep on the stubble.
And the widow down the lane has the right to collect fallen branches for firewood from the edge of the plot.
And someone else has rights to the fruit from that one apple tree in the corner. It's a bundle of overlapping, shared, seasonal rights.
That is impossible to put on a property deed.
You couldn't even begin to write it down in a way a central court could understand. So the state invents a radical simplification. Freehold property. They send out surveyors, draw a sharp line on a map, and declare this person owns this rectangular plot, period. All rights, all the time.
They extinguish all those other complex communal rights.
They wipe them out. They destroy the social forest to create a simple, taxable, and most importantly, mortgageable asset. A grid.
So this brings us back to the core concept. Legibility is the central problem of statecraft. To govern, you have to simplify. You have to create a map of the territory.
But if there's one slogan to take away from this whole deep dive, this is it. The map is not the territory.
And the state's map is a very specific kind of map.
It's an interested fiction. It's a map that only records what the state cares about. The state's map shows the property line, the road, the taxable assets. It doesn't show the quality of the soil or the sacred grove of trees or the long-running feud between 2 neighboring families.
It leaves out all the lived reality.
All of it. And the real danger, the point where this all turns tragic, is when the state becomes powerful enough to try and force the territory to look like the map.
Because the map is cleaner, it's tidier, it's easier to manage.
It's rational. And that brings us to the ideology that takes this natural administrative desire for tidiness and elevates it into a kind of religious faith. Scott calls it high modernism.
High modernism. This feels like the villain of the story, if an abstract concept can be a villain.
The very seductive villain. Scott is careful to say that high modernism isn't just being modern or liking technology. It's a specific, muscular, almost utopian faith in the power of scientific and technical progress.
It's the belief that the past is basically just garbage.
Right. The past is superstition, clutter, inefficiency. It's a problem to be solved. And high modernism believes that rational design, led by credentialed experts, can and should solve every human problem, from farming to housing to social relations.
It's the idea that society should be run like a well-oiled machine.
Precisely. And it's crucial to understand that high modernism has a very specific visual aesthetic. It is obsessed with a certain look.
It loves straight lines.
Loves them. It loves geometric shapes, grids, circles, squares. It loves visual order and, very importantly, segregation. It looks at a winding, messy medieval street with shops downstairs and apartments upstairs and people selling things on the sidewalk, and it sees disorder. It sees chaos.
And it looks at a parade ground with thousands of troops marching in perfect formation and sees order.
Yes. But as Scott points out so brilliantly, this is a catastrophic confusion. It confuses visual order with functional order.
A regiment of troops marching in lockstep looks incredibly orderly, but it's completely useless in a guerrilla war in a dense jungle.
And that winding medieval street looks chaotic. But it might be an incredibly efficient and resilient system for commerce, community, and safety. High modernism is blind to function. It only sees the form. It worships the abstraction.
And the prime example Scott uses to personify this ideology is the famous architect Le Corbusier.
The arch-high modernist,
Yeah.
the high priest of this way of thinking. If you want to understand this mindset in its purest form, you just have to look at Le Corbusier's plans for the city of Paris in the 1920s.
He looked at the historic heart of Paris. The Marais, Les Halles, these dense, vibrant, beautiful places. And he wanted to.
Bulldoze it. He literally wanted to level it.
Not just renovate, demolish.
Demolish. His Plan Voisin proposed raising a huge chunk of central Paris and replacing it with 18 massive, identical, 60-story cruciform towers set in a vast, windswept park, all connected by huge multi-lane highways. He called it the Radiant City.
And, looking at the drawings, on paper, I can almost see the appeal. All that sunlight, all that green space, the efficiency of the highways. No more dark, dirty, narrow alleys.
It's a powerful vision, but you have to look closer at the ideology behind it.
Yeah.
Le Corbusier hated the street. He actually wrote, and this is the direct quote, "We must kill the street."
Kill the street.
He saw the street as the source of all chaos and inefficiency. His vision was based on a rigid segregation of function. People live in the towers over here, they work in the factories over there, they shop in the commercial zones way over there.
And they travel between these zones on massive arteries designed only for cars. No loitering, no mixing, no chance encounters.
It's the death of public space. And this is where the great writer Jane Jacobs enters the story. She's the intellectual counterweight in the book.
Jane Jacobs, the author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she's the patron saint of the messy, functional city.
She is. And she understood exactly what Le Corbusier's high modernist vision was missing. She realized that the safety, the vitality, the very soul of a city doesn't come from vast open spaces or police surveillance towers. It comes from what she called eyes on the street.
The shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the people sitting on their porches, the kids playing on the sidewalk, the neighbors gossiping from their windows.
All of that. In a messy, dense, mixed-use neighborhood, there are always people around at all different times of day. The baker knows the neighbors. The bartender sees who comes and goes. If a stranger starts acting strangely, someone notices. It's a self-policing social ecosystem.
And Le Corbusier's plan for the Radiant City removes all of that. By putting people up in isolated towers and surrounding them with empty, unused parkland, he destroys the very fabric of community and safety.
He creates a void. And Scott brings up the city of Brasilia, the purpose-built capital of Brazil, as the place where this high modernist dream was actually built.
They really did it. They built a city from scratch in the middle of nowhere in the 1950s based on these principles.
A completely blank slate, so the planners could impose their vision without compromise. And if you look at Brasilia from an airplane, it's visually stunning. It's laid out in the shape of a bird or an airplane. It has these massive monumental axes and soaring modern buildings. It's a work of art.
But what is it like to live there, to walk around in it?
It's famously a social nightmare. It's an antisocial city. There are no street corners where you might bump into a friend. The residential superblocks are isolated from the commercial centers. The distances are too vast to walk, so you are trapped in your car or your apartment building. There is, as they say, no there.
The planners forgot that a city isn't a sculpture to be looked at from above. It's an organism to be lived in on the ground.
They satisfied the aesthetic desires of the planner at the complete expense of the daily life of the citizen.
Okay, so we've established the key components here. We have the state's tools of legibility, the maps, the census, the grid, and we have the ideology of high modernism, this supreme confidence in redesigning the world from scratch. But Scott says these things alone don't necessarily lead to a full-blown catastrophe.
That's right. You can have a high modernist architect design a really dysfunctional office building, and it's just, annoying. People hate working there. It's not a famine.
To get a true systems collapse, to get the great tragedies of the 20th century that he documents, Scott says you need a pernicious combination of 4 specific elements. It's like a chemical reaction that requires all the ingredients to be present.
A formula for disaster.
Let's map the system out for the listener. What are the 4 ingredients?
Okay, ingredient 1 is what we've been talking about. The administrative ordering of nature and society. This is the state's toolkit. The ability to create the simplified maps, the censuses, the property records, the ability to make a complex reality legible.
So you need the tools first, ingredient two.
Ingredient two is the high modernist ideology. This is the hubris, the supreme, unshakable self-confidence that you not only can, but should use those tools to redesign the entire world from first principles, and that your scientific plan is inherently superior to any form of local, traditional knowledge.
So you have the tools and you have the will to use them in a radical way. What's ingredient three?
An authoritarian state. This is the engine. This is the coercive power. You need a state that has the muscle to force its grand design on a population that might not want it.
Because in a functioning democracy, if the government tries to bulldoze your entire neighborhood to build a highway,
People protest, they organize, they sue, they vote you out of office. The plan gets watered down, compromised, or stopped altogether.
Yeah.
But in an authoritarian state, the planner has the police and the army at their disposal. They can simply say, you are moving, whether you like it or not. It's for the greater good.
and finally, ingredient four, the last piece of the puzzle.
A prostrate civil society. This creates the power vacuum. This usually happens in the aftermath of a major upheaval, a world war, a revolution, a period of intense colonialism. The population is exhausted, disorganized. Their traditional social structures have been broken down. They are often terrified or desperate. They simply lack the capacity to resist the state's grand plan.
So when you combine all four of those things, the tools of legibility, the ideology of high modernism, overwhelming authoritarian power, and a weakened society, that's when you get the perfect storm.
That's the recipe for state-sponsored catastrophe. And Scott takes us right into the eye of that storm with his analysis of Soviet collectivization.
This is one of the darkest and most powerful chapters in the book. This was Stalin's plan in the late 1920s and early 1930s to completely and violently transform Russian agriculture.
To understand this, we have to get inside the mindset of the Bolsheviks. They were high modernists to the absolute core. They looked at the Russian peasantry with their small family plots and their ancient farming methods, and they saw everything they despised.
They saw the past, they saw backwardness, inefficiency, superstition.
Exactly. They wanted to turn the peasant into a proletarian, a disciplined factory worker, but on the land. And they wanted to turn the millions of small farms into massive state-run grain factories.
That industrial metaphor again, grain factory.
It was a total obsession. And there's this one incredible detail Scott includes in the book that, for me, just explains the whole insane mindset. He describes a meeting that took place in a hotel room in Chicago in 1928.
Wait, Chicago? What on earth were Soviet planners doing in Chicago?
They were there because they were completely infatuated with American industrial agriculture. They worshipped the Ford and Caterpillar tractors. They believed the U.S. had cracked the code of achieving massive economies of scale.
So they went to the source?
They went to the source. Soviet planners sat in a hotel room with American agricultural engineers, guys who built massive farms in places like Montana. And together, on a piece of paper, they designed a massive Soviet farm.
They designed a Russian farm from a hotel room in Illinois.
Without ever setting foot on the land. They laid out a plan for a single-state farm, a sovkhoz, that would be 250,000 acres.
250,000 acres? That's almost impossible to conceive of.
It's unbelievably huge. For context, a very large American farm at that time might be a few thousand acres. They went for 250,000, and they did it entirely on the map. The map in the hotel room was a blank, flat surface, just waiting for their perfect geometric grid.
But the real land in Russia wasn't a blank, flat surface.
Of course not. If they had actually walked the land, they would have seen that it was filled with ravines, swamps, creeks, patches of different soil types. But the map didn't show any of that. The map was legible, the land was not.
It's the scientific forest all over again. They had this abstract belief that if a big tractor is efficient, then a gigantic tractor must be infinitely more efficient.
A fetish for scale. Scott calls it gigantomania. They believed economies of scale were infinite. So they ordered thousands of these massive tractors and combine harvesters. But when they tried to impose this Chicago hotel room plan onto the Russian reality, the gears just ground to a halt.
What actually happened on the ground?
I mean, everything that could go wrong did. The giant tractors were too heavy for the soil. They got bogged down in the mud. When one of them broke down, which was often, there were no spare parts, no mechanics, because in the name of efficiency, they had centralized all the repair stations hundreds of miles away.
But the biggest failure wasn't mechanical, was it? It was the human one.
It was. The plan systematically de-skilled the peasant.
They took away all their autonomy and knowledge.
A peasant farmer is an incredibly skilled and adaptable decision maker. They have generations of metis, of local knowledge.
Yeah.
They know that this little patch of soil is sandy and needs rye, but that patch over there is clay and is better for wheat. They know when the frost is coming just by the... It made that knowledge worthless. They were told from a central office, you will plow this field on this day, you will plant this seed at this depth. It turned intelligent, adaptable farmers into mindless cogs in a machine that didn't work.
And the peasants, understandably, resisted.
Fiercely and tragically. They slaughtered their own livestock rather than hand them over to the collective farms. They burned their crops. It was a brutal, low-grade civil war between the state's abstract grid and the people's struggle for survival.
And the result was famine on an unimaginable scale. The Holodomor in Ukraine.
Millions died of starvation. It was an absolute catastrophe of production and of humanity. But here is the fascinating systems insight that Scott uncovers, the twist I didn't see coming. The system as a whole survived this colossal failure. And the question is, how?
It survived because it cheated its own system.
Precisely. The giant grain factories were a total failure at actually feeding the country. So the Soviet state, while publicly denouncing private property, quietly allowed the peasants to keep tiny, private plots.
Little gardens, basically.
Tiny gardens behind their houses. We're talking about less than an acre of land per family. The state officially ignored these plots or dismissed them as backward and insignificant.
But they weren't insignificant at all.
They were the only thing that worked. It turns out these tiny, intensively managed, unplanned, illegible gardens were wildly productive.
Right.
At one point, Scott shows these private plots, which were maybe 3% of the total agricultural land, were producing something like 40% of the Soviet Union's meat and milk, and over half of this potatoes and vegetables.
So the giant high modernist dream, the grain factories, they were basically just giant stage sets. They were Potemkin villages.
They were a simulacrum of modern agriculture. They looked modern. They had the tractors, the 5-year plans, the impressive statistics on paper. But the country was actually being fed by the backward peasant using traditional small-scale methods in her own backyard. The formal, legible scheme was a parasite living on the energy of the informal, illegible reality.
That is a terrifying and powerful example of how this kind of thinking can kill. But Scott gives us another case study that's tragic in a slightly different way. Because the Soviet case is easy for us to dismiss. We can just say, well, Stalin was a tyrant. But what happens when the leader is actually a good guy with good intentions?
And that's the case of Tanzanian villagization, or jamaa, which means familyhood, in Swahili. This happened in the 1960s and 70s after Tanzania's independence.
And the leader was Julius Nyerere.
And by all historical accounts, Nyerere was not Stalin. He wasn't a monster. He was a widely respected intellectual, an anti-colonial leader, a philosopher, a teacher. He was, by all measures, benevolent. He genuinely wanted to develop his country and raise his people out of poverty.
But he fell into exactly the same high modernist trap.
He did. He looked out at his country and he saw what the state always sees, a problem of illegibility. Most of the rural population was dispersed. They lived in scattered homesteads and small hamlets across the vast landscape.
And Nyerere's argument was, on the surface, quite logical.
It was. He said, if people are scattered everywhere, we can't help them effectively. We can't build a school for every single family. We can't run a clean water pipe to every isolated hut. To modernize, to provide services, we need to bring the people together into proper villages.
So he launched this massive program called Operation Planned Villages.
It became the largest forced resettlement scheme in the history of modern Africa. Between 1973 and 1976, the government, using the military and party officials, moved about 5 million people.
5 million people in just 3 years. That is a logistical earthquake.
And because it was done in such a frantic rush, and because it was driven by that same high modernist aesthetic, it was done almost completely blindly. Planners sat in offices in the capital city with maps. They had to pick locations for thousands of new villages. How do you think they chose them?
They didn't choose them based on soil fertility or local knowledge?
Of course not. They chose them based on what was legible on the map. They picked spots that were near main roads, because for an administrator, the road is the lifeline. It's how you get in to inspect the village, how you deliver supplies, how you collect the crops for the state marketing board.
But there's usually a very good reason why people weren't already living right next to the main road.
Exactly. That's the local knowledge the map ignores.
Yeah.
Often the land right next to the road was swampy, or it was rocky, or it had no reliable water source. But the map didn't show rocky soil. The map just showed road good. So they moved millions of people there.
And the layout of the villages themselves, I'm guessing it wasn't organic.
It was the grid. Straight lines, military precision. House, 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 in a perfect row. Nair and his planners sincerely believed that a straight line was modern and scientific. They looked at the traditional African way of planting, what's called polycropping, where you mix corn and beans and squash all together in the same field, and they saw it as messy and primitive.
Even though that kind of mixed planting is actually an incredibly sophisticated ecological strategy, the plants support each other, they retain moisture in the soil, they confuse pests.
It is highly adapted metis local practical knowledge built up over centuries. But the state officials forced the farmers to plant in neat single-crop rows because a straight row of a single crop is easy to count and easy to supervise. It's legible.
And just like the Prussian forest and the Soviet collective, the system failed catastrophically.
Food production collapsed. Tanzania, which had been a food exporter, suddenly became dependent on international food aid to prevent famine. And what's so fascinating is the state's reaction to this failure. When the grand plan failed on a national scale, they didn't say, maybe our fundamental assumptions are wrong.
No, they doubled down.
They retreated to what Scott calls the miniaturization of perfection.
The model village.
Yes. They would pick one or two villages and pour enormous unsustainable resources into them. They'd make sure those ones worked perfectly. They'd bring all the foreign aid officials and the international journalists to see the shiny, successful model village.
And this creates a terrible feedback loop of delusion, doesn't it?
A catastrophic one.
Yeah.
The elite in the capital see the successful model and they think, see, our plan is brilliant. It works. The reason all the other villages are failing must be because the peasants are lazy or resistant or stupid.
Yeah.
It blinds the system to its own fundamental design flaws.
Meanwhile, the actual people in the real villages were quietly voting with their feet.
They were drifting back to their old lands in the bush or maintaining secret, informal fields far from the official village grid, just so they could survive. Once again, the informal, illegible world saved the people from the failures of the formal, legible plan.
Okay, we've used this word a few times now, and I think it's time to define it properly. Metis. This feels like the quiet hero of the book, doesn't it? This is the missing ingredient in all these grand plans.
It is absolutely the hero. Metis is an ancient Greek word, and it's very hard to translate directly into English with a single word. It means something like cunning, practical, hands-on, local knowledge. It's street smarts.
It's the knowledge of the sailor who knows how to navigate a tricky channel not by looking at a GPS, but by the color of the water and the feel of the wind.
Or the knowledge of the experienced farmer who knows when to plant, not by looking at a calendar, but by feeling the soil and smelling the air. It's embodied practical wisdom.
And Scott contrasts this with two other Greek terms for knowledge, techne and episteme.
Right. Techne is technical, rule-based knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge you can write down in a manual. How to build a bridge, according to engineering principles. Episteme is abstract, universal scientific knowledge. The laws of physics.
And high modernism worships episteme and techne.
It idolizes them. It believes in universal solutions. If a certain farming technique works in a laboratory in Chicago, it must therefore work everywhere in Russia. It ignores context.
But the core of metis is context. The core of metis is the phrase, well, it depends.
It depends is the wisest phrase in human language. It depends on the slope of this particular hill. It depends on the wind today. It depends on what happened last season. Metis is all about adaptability and improvisation. High modernism fails because it's rigid. It creates a static map for a dynamic, ever-changing world. Metis is fluid. It is the territory.
There's a fantastic example Scott uses to show just how essential this hidden metis is, even in our modern, supposedly rational industrial settings. He talks about the work-to-rule strike.
Oh, this is my favorite example in the whole book. It's so powerful. We usually think of a strike as workers walking off the job and stopping work.
Right, they refuse to work.
But in work-to-rule strike, the workers all show up, and they do their jobs. But they do them exactly as the official rulebook says.
They follow every single safety regulation, every bureaucratic protocol, every form-filling requirement to the absolute letter, no shortcuts, no fudging.
And what's the result? The entire system grinds to a halt, the factory stops producing, the trains stop running, the hospital descends into chaos.
But why? Shouldn't following the rules perfectly make things work better?
Because the rulebook, the state's formal, legible plan, is an impoverished, simplified map of the complex reality of the work. It cannot possibly capture all the contingencies, all the unexpected problems, all the tacit knowledge required to actually get the job done.
So in any complex system, a factory, a hospital, a school, things only function because the humans inside are constantly using their metis to fudge the rules.
They're constantly improvising. They know which safety rule is okay to bend in this specific situation. They know you have to jiggle the handle on that one machine just right to get it to start. They know which bureaucratic form isn't really important and can be skipped to save a patient's life.
So the formal structure, the state's plan, is actually completely dependent on the informal, unwritten, illegal improvisation of the workers to function at all.
Exactly. The formal scheme is a parasite on informal metis. The manager in his office looks at his spreadsheets and thinks he is in control because of the rule book. But the factory is actually running despite the rule book, thanks to the hidden practical knowledge of the people on the shop floor.
That completely flips the script on how we think about order and disorder. We usually think of rules and formal order as the things that hold back chaos. But Scott is arguing that this kind of rigid, imposed order is actually incredibly brittle.
It is. Real resilience, real functional order comes from diversity, from messiness, from the adaptability of metis.
It's the evolutionary lesson of the book. A diverse, messy forest survives the pest attack. A diverse, messy city survives economic shocks. A rigid, simplified monoculture system might look efficient for a brief moment under ideal conditions, but it is fatally fragile. One shock, one bad assumption in the plan, and the whole thing shatters.
That's the core insight.
So wow, we have covered a huge amount of ground here, from the dying spruce forests of 18th century Germany to the starving collective farms of the Soviet Union to the empty geometric villages of Tanzania. We need to bring this all home. What is the fundamental pattern we're seeing here?
I think the systems map is devastatingly clear. You start with an administrative need. The state needs to count or tax or control something.
This administrative need leads to simplification. You have to create a map, a metric, a grid, a standardized category.
This simplification then creates an engineered reality. The state uses its power to try and force the messy world to conform to the neatness of the map.
And because the map, by its very nature, leaves out all the critical biological and social complexity, the metis, this engineering inevitably leads to massive unintended consequences.
Failure, collapse, and then so often, the state's response to that failure isn't to question the map, it's to apply more coercion. The plan didn't work. We must not have forced it on the people hard enough. We need more discipline.
And I think it's really important to reiterate what you called the trap of good intentions.
Yes, this isn't a simple story of good versus evil. We're not saying that we shouldn't have maps or statistics. Of course we need them. We need to coordinate complex societies. We need to track pandemics. We need to deliver mail.
The problem isn't the map itself.
The problem is the imperialism of the map. It's the high modernist belief that the map is superior to the territory. It's when the planners fall in love with their beautiful rational abstraction and forget the messy, living reality on the ground.
The tragedy is that people like Julius Nyerere or the urban planners who followed Le Corbusier, they often sincerely wanted to save lives. They wanted to eliminate poverty and disease. But the very tools they used, these tools of radical simplification, blinded them to the actual needs and the actual genius of the people they were trying to help.
They tried to help the people as an abstract category on their map, but in doing so, they crushed the actual living people in the village.
So connecting this all back to our project, to crisis and perception, we might not have Soviet-style collectivization happening in most of the world today, but is this pattern, this system, still active?
It is everywhere. You just have to learn how to see it. Look at the modern corporate world. We're drowning in metrics. We manage by KPIs, by dashboards, by quarterly reports. That old slogan, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yep.
That is pure, unadulterated high modernism.
It's fiscal forestry in the office.
It absolutely is. When a manager reduces a complex creative employee to a single performance score, or a school system reduces a curious developing child to a standardized test result, they are doing exactly what the Prussian foresters did to the forest.
You're ignoring all the invisible underbrush, the mentorship, the team morale, the creativity, the social glue that actually makes the place work.
And just like the scientific forest, you might get some impressive short-term results. The quarterly numbers go up, the test scores tick up for a year or two, but in the long run, you are creating Waldsterben. You are creating burnout, fragility, a loss of innovation, a collapse of the very ecosystem you depend on.
And on a personal level, we are constantly trying to make ourselves legible to the algorithms that govern so much of our lives.
We are. We simplify our rich, complicated selves to fit the drop-down menu on a form. We curate our lives to look good on the rigid grid of a social media profile. The danger Scott identified isn't just in overt dictatorships anymore. It's in any powerful system that systematically values its abstract data over the messy, complex human reality.
It's a sobering realization. In a way, we are all being encouraged to become our own little monocultures.
And Scott's work is a powerful reminder to value the mess, to value the waste and the weeds, because that's where the resilience is. That's where the life is.
So here's a final provocative thought for you listening at home. We've talked a lot about how states simplify societies to make them legible. But how much of your own life are you simplifying just to make it legible to others, to your boss, to the algorithm, to the perceived grid of modern success? And what unique, messy, practical wisdom, what personal metis are you losing in the process?
That's the question to sit with.
We want to give full credit where it is overwhelmingly due. This entire discussion was based on the brilliant, paradigm-shifting book Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. This is a dense academic book at times, but it is so incredibly rewarding. If you found any of this discussion interesting, you absolutely need to read the full text.
It gives you a new language, a new lens for understanding the failures and fragilities of the modern world. You will never look at a city block or a corporate spreadsheet the same way again.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Until next time.